What if I told you there was a Roman military unit so terrifying that entire cities would surrender the moment they heard these soldiers were marching toward them? Not because of their numbers, not because of their armor, but because everyone knew. Once these men arrived, your city wouldn't just fall, it would vanish completely, as if it had never existed at all. No ruins, no survivors to tell the story. Nothing but ash and silence where thousands of people once lived. This isn't mythology. This isn't exaggeration. This is documented history that Rome tried very hard to keep quiet. Today, we're talking about the most brutal tactical unit in Roman military history, the specialized shock troops who didn't just conquer rebellions, they eliminated them, psychologically, physically, permanently. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why ancient historians went out of their way to avoid writing about what these men actually did. By the 1st century CE, Rome had a serious problem on its hands. The empire had grown massive, unprecedented in scale, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the deserts of North Africa. Millions of people, hundreds of cultures, dozens of languages, and many of these people absolutely hated being under Roman control. Rebellions were constant. Some were small, local uprisings, bandit groups, minor resistance movements. Those could be handled by standard legions, routine military operations. But others? Others were existential threats. When entire provinces rose up in coordinated revolt, when cities barricaded their gates and declared independence, when guerrilla fighters vanished into mountains and forests only to strike again and again, standard military tactics weren't enough. Rome needed something else. They needed a solution that didn't just defeat rebels. They needed something that would make rebellion itself unthinkable. Something so devastating that even thinking about defying Rome would fill people with absolute terror. So they created it. These weren't your typical legionaries. Standard Roman soldiers were incredibly effective, don't get me wrong. Disciplined, well-trained, organized into one of history's most successful military machines. They could conquer territory, hold ground, build fortifications, and win pitched battles against almost any opponent. But the shock troops, they had a different mission entirely. Their job wasn't to hold territory, it was to destroy it. Their job wasn't to defeat enemy armies, it was to break enemy populations so completely that resistance would never happen again. These units were specifically assembled for rebellions, situations where Rome had already tried negotiation, already tried standard military pressure, and found that the province or city simply would not submit. When diplomacy failed and regular legions couldn't suppress the uprising quickly enough, Rome would deploy these specialized forces, and then the nightmare would begin. Let's talk about Judea. The Jewish revolt that began in 66 CE was one of the most serious challenges Rome had faced in decades. This wasn't a minor provincial disturbance. This was a full-scale war. The Jewish population had been pushed to their breaking point by corrupt governors, religious provocations, and economic exploitation. When the rebellion finally erupted, it exploded across the entire region. Cities declared independence. Roman garrisons were massacred. Jewish fighters actually defeated a Roman legion in open battle, something that almost never happened. Rome was humiliated, and Rome does not tolerate humiliation. So Emperor Nero sent Vespasian, one of Rome's most capable generals, with multiple legions and explicit orders. end this rebellion permanently. Vespasian brought standard legions, yes, but he also brought something else: the shock troops. Their approach in Judea wasn't about winning battles, it was about creating examples. When they arrived at a rebellious city, they didn't just besiege it, they surrounded it completely, cut off all supplies, all escape routes, and then they waited. Not for surrender, though surrender was technically an option. They waited for starvation to set in, for desperation, for hope to die. And when they finally attacked, the violence was surgical and absolute. Every building was systematically dismantled, every wall pulled down stone by stone, every well poisoned or filled with rubble, every field salted or burned, everything of value, grain stores, tools, livestock, either taken or destroyed. But here's what made it psychological warfare. They didn't do this quickly. They did it slowly, methodically, so that nearby cities could watch, could see the smoke rising day after day, could hear the reports from refugees about what was happening. The message was clear. This is what happens when you defy Rome. Not just defeat, not just occupation, complete erasure. Scorched earth isn't a new concept in warfare. Many armies throughout history have used it, burning fields, destroying resources to deny them to the enemy. But what Rome's shock troops did went far beyond typical scorched earth tactics. They weren't just denying resources to enemy armies. They were making human habitation impossible. In Judea, entire towns were rendered permanently uninhabitable. The infrastructure that allowed communities to exist, water systems, roads, agricultural land, was systematically destroyed in ways that would take generations to rebuild. If there was an aqueduct bringing water to the city, demolished. Not just broken, completely torn apart, the channels filled, the engineering made irreparable without massive resources. Olive groves that had been cultivated for centuries, cut down and burned. The economic foundation of entire communities eliminated in days. Grain storage facilities, burned. The stored food that would have fed the population through winter, gone. This wasn't just about winning a battle. This was about making sure that even if people survived, they would have nothing to come back to, no way to rebuild, no foundation for future resistance. The land itself became the weapon. But Judea wasn't where this doctrine began. We need to go back further. Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, roughly a century before Judea, established many of these brutal tactics. When Caesar faced the massive Gallic uprising led by Vercingetorix in 52 BCE, he encountered something Rome hadn't seen before: a coordinated, unified resistance across multiple Gallic tribes. These weren't scattered barbarians. This was organized, strategic warfare. Vercingetorix was brilliant. He avoided pitched battles where Rome's legions excelled. Instead, he used scorched earth against Caesar, burning Gallic villages and supplies himself to deny them to Roman forces, forcing Caesar's army to march through wastelands. But Caesar responded with something even more devastating. When Caesar's forces captured rebellious settlements, they didn't just pacify them. They made examples that would echo across Gaul for generations. At Avaricum, one of the wealthiest cities in Gaul, Caesar's forces massacred nearly the entire population, roughly 40,000 people according to ancient sources. The city that had been a center of Gallic culture and commerce was left as a monument to Roman vengeance. But the most infamous example was Alesia. After defeating Vercingetorix in one of history's most remarkable sieges, Caesar didn't just accept surrender. He systematically broke Gallic resistance through calculated brutality. Prisoners weren't just enslaved. They were distributed throughout the Roman world, families separated permanently, cultural identity deliberately fragmented. Settlements that had supported the rebellion were burned. Not raided, burned completely. The shock troops would arrive, evacuate anything valuable, then set fires that would consume everything else. Agricultural land was devastated. Livestock slaughtered en masse, not for food, but for terror. The Gauls were pastoralists. Their wealth and survival depended on their herds. Destroying those herds destroyed their future. This was the blueprint, the model that later commanders would refine and perfect. Here's what made these tactics so effective. They attacked the mind as much as the body. Physical defeat is one thing. People can recover from that. Cities can be rebuilt. Armies can be reformed. But psychological defeat? That's permanent. When a city knows that resistance doesn't just mean battle, it means their children will starve, their homes will be ash, their civilization will be erased. Most choose submission. The shock troops understood this perfectly. They would often publicize their approach, send messengers ahead, make sure everyone in the region knew exactly what was coming, let the fear spread. Some cities would surrender immediately, without a single arrow fired. The reputation alone was enough. But for cities that resisted, the shock troops made absolutely certain that their fate would be remembered, that their destruction would be so complete, so horrifying, that it would serve as a permanent deterrent. Refugees fleeing destroyed cities became weapons themselves, spreading terror through their stories, their trauma visible to everyone they encountered. This is sophisticated psychological warfare. Understanding that human behavior is driven more by fear of loss than hope of gain. That one brutal example is worth 1,000 diplomatic agreements. Rome's shock troops weren't just soldiers, they were engineers of trauma. Let's get specific about methodology. When shock troops arrived at a target city, they followed a systematic process refined over decades of rebellion suppression. Phase 1, total isolation. Complete encirclement. No one gets in, no one gets out. Supply lines severed immediately. This serves multiple purposes. It prevents reinforcement, obviously. But it also creates a pressure cooker inside the city. Resources dwindle. Panic spreads. Internal conflicts emerge as people turn on each other. Meanwhile, people outside can see what's happening, but can't help. The psychological impact on neighboring communities is devastating. Phase 2, demonstration of capability. Limited assaults designed not to breach the walls, but to show overwhelming force. Siege equipment positioned prominently. Engines that could throw massive stones or fire. The message: we can destroy you whenever we choose. Surrender is your only rational option. Often this phase included psychological operations, catapulting messages over walls, spreading disinformation, offering seemingly generous terms to create internal division between those who wanted to fight and those who wanted to surrender. Phase 3, the breaking point. If surrender didn't come, the assault would begin in earnest. But this wasn't about quick victory. The shock troops would breach walls, yes, but then systematically work through the city in organized units, block by block, building by building. Anything that couldn't be taken was burned. Anyone who resisted was killed immediately and publicly. The goal was to create chaos and terror, to break the will of defenders so completely that organized resistance became impossible. Phase 4. Systematic erasure. This is where it gets truly horrifying. After military resistance collapsed, the real work began. Every structure of value was dismantled or destroyed. Temples, administrative buildings, anything that represented the city's identity or capability to function. Infrastructure was sabotaged in ways designed to be irreparable without massive investment. Aqueducts weren't just broken, they were collapsed and buried. Roads weren't just blocked, they were dug up and scattered. Agricultural resources were eliminated. Fields burned or salted. Orchards cut down. Irrigation systems destroyed. The population, those who survived, was either enslaved and scattered across the empire or driven into the wilderness with nothing. The goal was to ensure that even if someone wanted to rebuild, they couldn't. The knowledge, the resources, the population base, all gone. Phase 5. The message. Finally, the shock troops would leave markers, sometimes literal monuments declaring Roman victory, sometimes just the ruins themselves, left as a warning. Neighboring cities were often forced to send representatives to witness the destruction, to see firsthand what defying Rome meant. Then those representatives would return home and spread the message. This is what happens. This is what Rome does to those who resist. Let's talk about numbers, because they matter. During the Judean revolt, ancient sources report staggering casualties. Josephus, who witnessed these events, claims over 1 million died during the war and subsequent suppression. Modern historians debate these exact figures. Ancient sources often exaggerated numbers. But even conservative estimates put the death toll in the hundreds of thousands. More importantly, the Jewish population of Judea was fundamentally altered. Communities that had existed for centuries were scattered. The Temple in Jerusalem, the absolute center of Jewish religious and cultural life, was destroyed so thoroughly that only one wall remained. This wasn't collateral damage. This was the intended outcome. In Gaul, Caesar himself boasted about the scale of destruction. Over 1 million Gauls enslaved according to ancient sources. Entire tribes displaced or eliminated. The cultural impact lasted for generations. Gallic languages, traditions, social structures, all systematically suppressed and replaced with Roman alternatives. These weren't just military victories. These were cultural genocides executed with methodical precision. So here's a fascinating question. Why don't we hear more about these specific units? Roman historians wrote extensively about military campaigns. We have detailed accounts of battles, sieges, conquests, but the shock troops themselves, the specific units that executed these scorched earth campaigns, relatively little direct documentation. Why? Several reasons. First, Roman historians were often writing for Roman audiences, and even Romans were sometimes uncomfortable with the level of brutality involved. There's a difference between conquering an enemy in honorable battle and systematically erasing civilian populations. Writers like Tacitus and Suetonius documented Roman atrocities, yes, but often with an air of moral judgment. They recognized these actions as effective but troubling. Second, much of the detailed operational knowledge about these units was probably considered military intelligence. You don't publicize exactly how your terror tactics work. That reduces their effectiveness. Third, and perhaps most importantly, these operations were often conducted in provinces that later became integrated parts of the empire. Once Judea was fully pacified, once Gaul became loyal Roman territory, why draw attention to the horrific methods used to achieve that pacification? Better to let those memories fade. Better to focus on the peaceful, prosperous present rather than the traumatic past. The shock troops did their job so effectively that Rome benefited from their very obscurity. These tactics didn't die with Rome. You can trace a direct line from Roman shock troop methodology to later military doctrines throughout history. Medieval siege warfare adopted many of these psychological elements. The Mongol conquests famously used similar terror tactics, publicizing the total destruction of cities that resisted to encourage surrender elsewhere. Modern counterinsurgency doctrine, particularly scorched earth campaigns in various 20th century conflicts, echoes these same principles. Make resistance so costly that it becomes unthinkable. Sherman's march to the sea during the American Civil War, systematically destroying the South's economic infrastructure to break the will to fight, is a direct descendant of Roman shock troop tactics. The bombing campaigns of World War II, designed as much to break civilian morale as to destroy military targets, follow the same psychological logic. Even today, military theorists study these campaigns when analyzing how to suppress insurgencies and rebellions. The fundamental insight remains: sometimes defeating an enemy militarily isn't enough. Sometimes you need to break them so completely that the very idea of resistance dies. Which brings us to an uncomfortable question we need to address. Were these tactics effective? Absolutely, brutally, terrifyingly effective. Did they work? Yes. Rebellions in regions subjected to these shock troop campaigns were far less frequent afterward. The deterrent effect was real and lasting. But effectiveness doesn't equal justification. What the Roman shock troops did would be considered war crimes by any modern standard. Systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure, collective punishment, cultural genocide. The people who experienced these campaigns weren't soldiers. They were farmers, merchants, families. Many had no direct involvement in rebellion. They were simply in the wrong place when Rome decided to make an example. Children starved because fields were burned. Elderly people died of thirst because wells were poisoned. Entire family lines were erased because Rome needed to send a message. We can acknowledge the historical significance and military effectiveness of these tactics, while also recognizing them as fundamentally inhumane. Rome built one of history's greatest civilizations, but that civilization was built in part on the ashes of communities that were completely erased from existence. Let me give you some specific examples of cities that were literally erased. Bethar. During the Bar Kokhba revolt, this major Jewish fortress city was completely destroyed. Archeological evidence shows systematic demolition. The city was never rebuilt. Today, scholars still debate its exact location because it was so thoroughly eliminated. Gergovia, a major Gallic stronghold that resisted Caesar. After its eventual fall, it was abandoned and depopulated. The thriving center, it had been never returned. Gamla, a city in the Golan during the Judean revolt. Roman forces besieged it, breached the walls, and then proceeded to kill virtually every inhabitant. Josephus describes people throwing themselves off cliffs to avoid capture. The city was left in ruins that remain visible today, a frozen moment of Roman fury. These aren't legends. These are documented historical events where cities with thousands of inhabitants simply cease to exist as functioning communities. The archaeological record shows this clearly. layers of ash and destruction, then nothing. No rebuilding phase, no recovery, just abandonment. So let's come back to where we started. Rome created specialized shock troops whose entire purpose was to make rebellion unthinkable through absolute devastation. They perfected tactics that combined military force with psychological warfare, systematic resource destruction, and cultural erasure. They were so effective that entire provinces learned submission through witnessing what happened to those who resisted, and they were so brutal that even Rome itself preferred not to discuss them too explicitly. These units succeeded so completely that they essentially made themselves unnecessary. Once a few examples had been made, once a few cities had been erased, the message was clear across the empire. Defy Rome, and you don't just lose a battle. You lose everything. Your city, your culture, your future, your place in history itself. That's the ultimate victory in psychological warfare, when your reputation alone prevents conflict, when the mere possibility of your deployment ensures compliance. The Roman shock troops achieved that. They became the nightmare that prevented rebellion through pure terror of what they represented. And perhaps most chillingly, their legacy lives on in military doctrine to this day, refined and adapted, but fundamentally unchanged. The tactics that erased cities from the map 2,000 years ago are still studied, still analyzed, still implemented in various forms across the world. Because as much as we might wish otherwise, they work. That's the uncomfortable truth we have to sit with. Sometimes the most brutal methods are also the most effective. Rome understood that, built an empire on it, and made sure that understanding was written in ash and silence across dozens of cities that no longer exist. But here's what's fascinating and disturbing about all of this. We don't have to rely solely on ancient texts to understand what happened. The ground itself tells the story. Modern archaeology has uncovered layers of destruction in cities across the former Roman Empire that perfectly align with the historical accounts of shock troop operations. At Gamla in the Golan Heights, archaeologists have found evidence of the 67 CE assault exactly as Josephus described it. Hundreds of ballista stones, the ammunition for Roman siege weapons, scattered throughout the city, arrowheads embedded in walls, burn layers showing systematic fire damage. But more tellingly, the destruction layer is uniform and complete. This wasn't gradual decline or natural disaster. This was methodical demolition. The city's defensive walls show evidence of being deliberately dismantled after the siege, not just breached, completely taken apart, stone by stone. And here's the chilling part. After that destruction layer, there's nothing. No rebuilding phase, no recovery. The city was abandoned and never reoccupied, exactly as the shock troop doctrine intended. The same pattern appears at dozens of sites across the ancient world. In Gaul, cities that Caesar mentions destroying show archaeological evidence of sudden, violent ends, followed by complete abandonment or total reorganization as Roman colonies. The Gallic city of Bibracte, once a thriving center of Celtic culture, shows a clear destruction layer from the mid-1st century BCE, right when Caesar's campaigns were happening. After that layer, the site was gradually abandoned as the population was relocated to nearby Augustodunum, a new Roman city built on Rome's terms. In Britain, hill forts that resisted Roman conquest show similar patterns. Maiden Castle in Dorset provides perhaps the most visceral evidence. Archaeologists excavating the eastern entrance found a war cemetery containing the remains of defenders who died fighting the Romans. Some skeletons show evidence of ballista bolt impacts, massive projectiles that punch through bone. Others show sword cuts. One skull has a Roman sword blade still embedded in it. These weren't just casualties of battle. The positioning and nature of the wounds suggest systematic execution after the fort fell, and after the Romans took Maiden Castle. Like so many others, it was abandoned. The population relocated to the new Roman town of Durnovaria. But perhaps the most haunting evidence isn't in individual cities, it's in the broader landscape. Agricultural archaeology, the study of ancient farming patterns through soil analysis, pollen records, and field systems, reveals something striking about regions that faced shock troop campaigns. In many areas, there's clear evidence of agricultural collapse, precisely when we know Roman suppression campaigns occurred. Pollen analysis from lake sediments in Gaul shows a dramatic shift in vegetation around 50 BCE forest regrowth, reduction in cultivated plant pollen, signs that farmland was abandoned on a massive scale. This isn't natural climate change. The pattern is too sudden and too localized to areas that historical sources tell us face the worst of Caesar's campaigns. It's the signature of scorched earth warfare, fields burned, farmers killed or enslaved, land left to return to wilderness. In Judea, similar patterns appear after both the Great Revolt and the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Regions that were intensively cultivated before the revolts show evidence of agricultural abandonment that lasted for generations. Terraced hillsides, the infrastructure of ancient agriculture, were left to erode. Irrigation systems fell into disrepair. The landscape itself was traumatized. And then there are the mass graves. At multiple sites associated with Roman siege warfare, archaeologists have found burials containing dozens or hundreds of individuals, often showing signs of violent death. Near Jerusalem, excavations have uncovered burial caves hastily filled during the siege of 70 CE. The skeletal evidence tells a story of starvation and disease as well as violence. Children's bones showing malnutrition, adults with healed wounds from earlier fighting who later died of illness, entire families buried together. These weren't soldiers dying in battle. These were civilians caught in the systematic destruction of their city. At some sites, the evidence is even more disturbing. Mass graves where bodies were clearly disposed of without ceremony or respect, thrown in and quickly covered. This suggests such large numbers of dead that proper burial became impossible. Or it suggests that the shock troops simply didn't care about allowing proper burial rites for the defeated. Either way, it's evidence of destruction on a scale that overwhelmed the society's ability to cope. Roman siege equipment, or evidence of it, has been found at multiple sites, giving us insight into the engineering of destruction. At Masada, archaeologists found the ramp the Romans built to breach the fortress, a massive earthwork that required moving thousands of tons of material. But they also found evidence of the systematic nature of Roman siege work. The circumvallation wall, a complete barrier surrounding the fortress to prevent escape, built with precision even though it crossed difficult terrain. This wasn't improvised, it was engineered, calculated, professional. At Burnswark in Scotland, archaeologists have found what appears to be evidence of a Roman training exercise in siege warfare. Two Roman camps facing a native hill fort, with thousands of lead sling bullets and ballista balls scattered around. The fort itself shows no evidence of being occupied when this happened. The current theory? The Romans were using the abandoned fort as a practice target, training their troops in the techniques they would use against resistant populations, practicing systematic destruction. But sometimes the most powerful evidence is what's not there. Cities that appear in records from before Roman conquest, but disappear afterward. Gaps in the archaeological record where there should be continuity. Cartographic analysis of the ancient world reveals something striking. The density of settlements in regions like Gaul and Judea decreased dramatically after Roman conquest. Not because people stopped living there, the total population eventually recovered, but because the pattern of habitation changed. Instead of many small independent settlements, you get fewer larger Roman-style towns. The old pattern of life, village-based, tribally organized, was broken. This is harder to see than a destruction layer, but it's just as significant. It's evidence of cultural erasure on a massive scale. The archaeological evidence transforms this from ancient history into something more immediate and real. These weren't just stories written by biased historians. This happened. The evidence is in the ground. Cities were systematically destroyed. Populations were scattered. Landscapes were transformed. And crucially, this evidence shows that the historical accounts, even when they seem exaggerated, were often accurate. When Josephus describes Jerusalem's destruction, when Caesar describes Gallic devastation, they weren't just using rhetorical flourishes. They were describing what actually happened. We've talked a lot about destruction and death. But what about the people who survived? Because despite the brutality, despite the systematic devastation, some people did survive. They were enslaved, scattered, displaced, but they lived. And their experiences give us a different perspective on the shock troop campaigns. The slave trade connection. One of the most significant economic impacts of shock troop operations was the massive influx of slaves into Roman markets. After major suppression campaigns, tens or hundreds of thousands of people would be sold into slavery. This had empire-wide effects. Slave prices would drop dramatically after major conquests, simple supply and demand. The market was flooded. Roman landowners could acquire labor cheaply. This fueled the expansion of latifundia, massive slave-worked estates that transformed Roman agriculture. But it also transformed the lives of the enslaved. Gallic warriors who had fought for their independence ended up working in Spanish mines or Egyptian quarries. Jewish scholars who had studied in Jerusalem ended up as household slaves in Rome or Athens. Young women from destroyed cities became domestic servants, sometimes concubines, scattered throughout the empire. The systematic dispersal meant families were separated, cultural groups fragmented, languages and traditions at risk of being lost. Some adapted, learned Latin or Greek, adopted Roman ways, found ways to survive in their new circumstances. Others never adapted. Historical sources occasionally mention slave revolts led by people from recently conquered regions, desperate attempts to resist even in bondage. But most just endured, lived, survived, tried to maintain some connection to who they had been. Those who weren't enslaved often became refugees. After a shock troop campaign destroyed their city, they would flee to neighboring regions, sometimes welcomed, sometimes merely tolerated, sometimes resented as burdens. These refugee populations created diaspora communities that would persist for generations. After the destruction of the Temple, Jewish communities formed throughout the Roman world. Some had existed before, but the refugees from Judea's devastation massively expanded them. These communities maintained their identity despite being scattered. They preserved their language, their religion, their cultural memory. In fact, some scholars argue that Judaism became stronger in diaspora because it had to. Without the temple, without a homeland, identity had to be maintained through practice and belief rather than place. Similarly, Celtic culture survived in modified form in Gaul and Britain, despite Roman conquest. The old ways didn't completely disappear. They went underground, blended with Roman culture, emerged in new hybrid forms. The shock troops could destroy cities. They could scatter populations. But they couldn't completely erase cultural memory. And then there were those who chose cooperation over resistance. Every major suppression campaign involved local collaborators, people who sided with Rome, who helped identify resistance leaders who profited from the conquest. These collaborators often became the foundation of Roman administration in conquered territories. They were rewarded with land, positions, wealth. They became the new elite in Romanized provinces. But they also carried the stigma of having betrayed their own people. Ancient sources occasionally mention the contempt directed at collaborators, viewed as traitors by those who resisted, seen as tools by the Romans who used them. Yet without them, Roman conquest would have been far more difficult. They provided the local knowledge, the legitimacy, the administrative infrastructure that made occupation sustainable. Perhaps most interesting is what happened to the children born after conquest. The generation that grew up in the aftermath of shock troop campaigns, they had no memory of independence. They knew their parents' stories, but they themselves had only ever lived under Roman rule. For them, resistance wasn't a lived reality. It was mythology, stories of a past they couldn't quite connect to. Many of this generation became thoroughly Romanized. They learned Latin, adopted Roman customs, saw themselves as Roman citizens rather than conquered peoples. This was Rome's ultimate victory. Not just military conquest, but cultural transformation. Within 2 or 3 generations, regions that had fiercely resisted became loyal parts of the empire. Not because they were held down by force, though garrisons remained, but because the population's identity had changed. The shock troop campaigns created the conditions for this transformation. By destroying the old power structures, the old ways of life, they created a blank slate where Roman culture could be written. Modern research on trauma helps us understand something the Romans couldn't have fully grasped: the long-term psychological impact of mass violence. What we now call intergenerational trauma, the way traumatic experiences affect not just those who lived through them, but their children and grandchildren. The populations that survived shock troop campaigns carried that trauma forward. Stories passed down through families, cultural narratives of destruction and loss, a collective memory of resistance and defeat. This manifested in different ways in different communities. For Jewish populations, the destruction of the temple became central to religious and cultural identity, commemorated annually, remembered in prayer, a defining trauma that shaped Judaism for millennia. For Gallic populations, the memory was different, more diluted over time as Romanization progressed, but traces remained in local legends, in place names, in cultural practices that persisted despite Roman overlay. Some communities developed what we might now recognize as a kind of cultural PTSD, a deep-seated fear of authority, an assumption that resistance would be met with overwhelming violence, a survival strategy of accommodation rather than confrontation. This served Roman interests perfectly. A traumatized population is a compliant population. But it also created lasting psychological patterns that would persist long after Rome fell. The regions of Europe that faced the most brutal Roman conquest often developed cultural patterns of deference to authority that lasted into the modern era. Whether this is coincidence or the echo of ancient trauma is debatable, but it's worth considering. The shock troop campaigns had profound economic effects that often get overlooked. When you destroy a region's agricultural infrastructure, when you scatter its population, when you eliminate its markets and trade networks, you're not just winning a military campaign. You're completely reshaping the economy. Resource extraction. After conquest, Roman economic patterns were imposed on conquered regions. Resources that had been used locally were now extracted for empire-wide use. Gallic gold mines that had benefited Gallic tribes now funded Roman military campaigns elsewhere. Judean olive oil that had been a local industry was now part of Mediterranean trade networks controlled from Rome. British tin, Spanish silver, Egyptian grain, all flowing toward Rome rather than benefiting local populations. This wasn't accidental, it was policy. Conquest was supposed to be profitable. The shock troops made this possible by destroying the existing economic structures that might have resisted Roman extraction. Labor reorganization. The massive enslavement campaigns reorganized labor throughout the empire. Conquered populations became the workforce for Roman projects, building roads, constructing aqueducts, working estates, mining precious metals. This had several effects. It provided cheap labor that made Roman infrastructure projects feasible. It removed potentially resistant populations from their homelands. And it created economic dependencies. Regions whose populations had been enslaved away now needed to import workers or reorganize their economies entirely. Roman conquest brought regions into empire-wide market systems. This could be beneficial: access to goods from across the known world, better roads for trade, standardized currency. But it also made local economies vulnerable to distant disruptions. A famine in Egypt could affect grain prices in Gaul. A military campaign in Germania could disrupt trade routes to Britain. The shock troop campaigns accelerated this integration by destroying local, self-sufficient economic systems and replacing them with Rome-dependent alternatives. Urbanization patterns. Roman policy strongly favored urbanization. Cities were easier to administer than scattered rural populations. They facilitated tax collection, legal administration, cultural control. After shock troop campaigns, surviving populations were often encouraged or forced to relocate to new Roman-style towns. This transformed the landscape. Instead of dispersed settlements, you got concentrated urban centers surrounded by agricultural hinterlands. This pattern would persist long after Rome fell, shaping European settlement patterns for centuries. Here's something remarkable. The shock troop doctrine Rome developed didn't die with the empire. It was too effective, too well documented, too obviously useful for maintaining control over restive populations. Byzantine continuation. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, continued using these tactics for centuries after the Western Empire fell. When Emperor Justinian faced the Nika riots in 532 CE, his general Belisarius used shock troop methodology to suppress them. The Hippodrome in Constantinople was surrounded, escape routes cut off, then systematic slaughter, possibly 30,000 dead. The brutality was calculated to prevent future urban uprisings. It worked. Constantinople remained relatively stable for centuries. Medieval adoption. Medieval European warfare inherited Roman tactical thinking through military manuals and institutional memory. The systematic destruction of enemy economic resources, crops burned, livestock slaughtered, infrastructure destroyed, became standard practice. This was called chevauchée in France, devastatio in Latin military texts. The logic was pure Roman shock troop doctrine: make resistance economically unsustainable. When English forces conducted chevauchées through France during the 100 Years' War, they were applying tactics refined by Caesar 1,000 years earlier. European colonial powers faced similar problems to ancient Rome: how to control large, hostile populations with limited military forces. And they reached similar conclusions. British forces in India, Africa, and elsewhere used systematic destruction of resources to suppress resistance. Villages burned, crops destroyed, populations relocated. The Boer Wars saw British forces using concentration camps and farm burning to break Afrikaner resistance. Classic shock troop methodology updated for modern conditions. French forces in Algeria used similarly brutal tactics to suppress independence movements. 20th century escalation. The industrialization of warfare. In the 20th century brought Roman shock troop principles to horrifying new scales. Strategic bombing in World War II, the deliberate targeting of cities to break civilian morale, was shock troop doctrine delivered from aircraft. The firebombing of Dresden, Tokyo, and other cities had the same logic Caesar used at Avaricum: make resistance so costly that it becomes unthinkable. Sherman's march to the sea in the American Civil War was explicitly designed to make the South howl, to destroy the economic infrastructure supporting the Confederate war effort. Sherman's officers had studied Roman military history. They knew exactly what they were doing. Even the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki followed shock troop logic: create such overwhelming devastation that further resistance seems futile. Whether these modern applications were justified is a separate question. But their connection to Roman methods is undeniable. We like to think of Rome as a civilizing force, bringing law, infrastructure, culture to barbarian regions. And that's partly true. Rome did build roads, aqueducts, cities, did spread literacy, legal systems, architectural knowledge. But Rome's ability to do all that rested on a foundation of overwhelming violence. The roads weren't built through willing cooperation. They were built after resistance had been crushed. The cities weren't accepted through persuasion. They were established after the old settlements had been destroyed. The civilization was built on the bones of those who opposed it. This isn't unique to Rome. Every empire follows this pattern to some degree. The violence is usually downplayed in the civilization's own narratives, but it's always there. Let me end this extended exploration with something more personal. We know the names of the Roman commanders: Caesar, Vespasian, Titus, Agricola. Their names are in history books, their achievements celebrated, their tactics studied. But we don't know the names of most of the people they destroyed. The farmer in Gaul whose fields were burned, the merchant in Jerusalem whose shop was looted, the child in Britain who watched her village destroyed. They're not in the histories. They didn't get memorials. Their stories weren't preserved. At best, they're statistics. 40,000 dead at Avaricum, hundreds of thousands enslaved in Judea. But each of those numbers was a person with hopes, fears, families, dreams. A young man who wanted to be a scholar, a woman who was planning her wedding, an elderly person sharing stories with grandchildren. All of that, gone, erased, lost to history,